Thank you, everyone, and welcome to day 4. We're about to hear from John Melican, Elliptic's one and only. I've seen many of his chats. He's going to be completely entertaining. Get excited. We're going to hear about regulating crypto globally, which countries are doing it, and who's getting it right. Thank you so much, John. Welcome to the stage.
Great. Thanks for the introduction. All of it probably untrue, but thank you again for saying those kind words. Yes, John Melican, I'm going to talk to you specifically about a fairly narrow topic that we'd like to address because it's so critically important at this time. We're going to talk about sanctions compliance in the crypto era. We're really talking about what's happening, what it is, how we can think about it. And I'm going to try to address that in a series of questions. As everyone knows, on February 22nd or February 24th, the Russians invaded Ukraine, a full-scale invasion that's left thousands of dead and millions fleeing for their lives. The weeks that followed that attack, really we saw a set of global economic sanctions coordinated at an unprecedented level and scale that targeted almost every single aspect of the Russian economy, including its financial sector, as well as some of its most powerful and wealthy individuals. These sanctions really included the direct sanctioning of most Russian banks and the removal of virtually every major Russian bank from the SWIFT network. Many of us who've been in the industry for a long time have heard in sanction discussions that, we could just remove them from the SWIFT network, or they'll finally remove somebody from the SWIFT network. No one will ever be removed from the SWIFT network. This is finally the time that's actually happened. So it's never been done before. It's been a huge change for the banking industry to see this actually happen. And it's critically important that we recognize that this event caused that eventuality and really has empowered sanctions at an entirely new level. To give you an idea of how important these sanctions are, joining these sanctions for were leading jurisdictions, the EU, the UK, Australia, Japan. And to give a sense of history, this is the first time that the Swiss have actually joined in imposing sanctions. With their long history of neutrality, this is the first time they've really come out and joined any form of global sanctions. So it is a remarkable event. The details of these sanctions packages, and I'll talk about them a little bit, aren't actually that relevant to the discussion. Taken together, the sanctions packages line up essentially to say it's an entirely bad time to be holding rubles, and it's a really bad time to have been invested in Russia. So the sanctions have made it virtually impossible to use Russian banking system. Effectively, the entire Russian banking system, with a few exceptions, has been cut off from the global economy. Right now, through a series of questions, I'd like to briefly discuss how these sanctions relate to virtual assets, in particular virtual currencies, and do it through a little bit of sort of back and forth that we'd normally do in person. But I'll start asking the questions, and we can kind of work through it together. Well, why talk about crypto as part of a sanctions regime when these sanctions regimes have traditionally been and are primarily focused around banks? Well, the latest round of sanctions are being imposed on a new financial environment. The traditional financial environment has recently developed a serious alternative to the banking sector for the first time, specifically blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies. Because of as we all know, the meteoric rise of crypto in the public consciousness and some spectacular valuations for particular assets, as well as some infamous use cases of crypto being used in criminal activity, regulators are keenly aware of the potential of cryptocurrencies and aware of their potential to be used to evade the vast network of sanctions that have been put together by the global community over the last month. Remember just 6 years ago in 2014, when many of us were sitting in banks and the sanctions came down after the Russian invasion of Crimea. This was a similar but less comprehensive set of sanctions that were imposed. Crypto at that time was an entirely different space. At that time, it wasn't really on the mind of consumers that much, except for a few fortunate folks who may have been very interested and invested. It was on the mind of some very forward-thinking bankers, but it really wasn't on the mind of regulators. The public and regulators are now aware of crypto and aware of its ability to potentially be used to evade sanctions. And they're looking at the traditional sanctions environment and how it relates to banks and saying, why isn't crypto included, or should it be included? And that's really what we're going to talk about. So let me start with the most obvious of questions. Can the Russian government use crypto to evade global sanctions? Well, the answer to that is yeah, but probably not really. Crypto, with its pseudo-anonymity, its ability to move funds outside the now sanctioned banking sector, appears on its face to be a viable means to evade sanctions. However, crypto, just like every other alternative or non-bank store of value, art, jewels, gold, crypto has a liquidity problem when it comes to sanctions evasion at a national level. Let's just put that in context. Has anyone ever tried to buy a 5G network with gold bars? You can't exactly run a credit card network with a dozen Picassos and a Rembrandt. And you can't really sell wheat and natural gas in exchange for a bathtub full of diamonds. It just doesn't work that way. You know, we live in a world of trade finance, global trade. Running large economies really requires a level of liquidity that crypto assets just don't have at this time. For vague reference, the total market cap of crypto assets is conservatively valued at between $2 and $3 trillion, which is roughly the same size as the Russian economy. There's just not enough crypto moving around to provide for an economy that size to operate off of it in any meaningful way. It would be incredibly challenging for Russia to even mitigate the effects of economic sanctions that have been put in place through the use of crypto assets. It just wouldn't have any significant impact because of the lack of liquidity. So there's the second important question that everybody's asking, which is, could a sanctioned oligarch or soon to be sanctioned oligarch, or simply wealthy Russians looking to avoid the plummeting value of the ruble, use crypto to evade sanctions? The answer is, again, regrettably, probably yes. But in this case, you know, there is sort of the liquidity problem doesn't apply as much because the volumes are going to be significantly lower. With the ruble in decline, the stock market is now closed in Russia. Capital restrictions are quickly being put in place. Many Russians, at least the Russians with a few rubles to rub together, are looking to get out of rubles into a more stable store of value to evade either individual sanctions or just the loss of their value. On an individual level, Russians can use rubles to purchase crypto in the form of assets like BTC or stable coins such as USDC or Tether. They're likely going to do this through exchanges that accept ruble to crypto exchange or ruble to crypto pair. Simply put, Russians are looking for a fiat on-ramp. They're looking to take the soon to be worthless ruble and put it in some crypto that they can move. Once the crypto is purchased using rubles, that value can then be transferred or exchanged outside the traditional banking sector, and therefore outside the reach of the majority of sanctions that have been implemented through the traditional FI sector, targeting banks. This means that personal evasion of sanctions using crypto is possible, just like it's possible in cash and in equities and commodities that can also be used to evade sanctions and have been used to evade sanctions in North Korea, Cuba, Iran for years. This isn't something particular or particularly negative to crypto. It's just something that crypto, because of its popularity now and because the industry is new, we have to wrestle with. And this is what regulators are thinking and why regulators need to engage with the crypto industry as well as the payments industry to really bring the important sanctions into effect in the crypto industry. And that's what they're going to do. So how do we think about crypto compliance? How do we think about that as an industry? One way of thinking about it is just like every other asset class. Crypto operates in an ecosystem. We have to think about crypto as the same type of ecosystem as equities or commodities. The payments world, specifically banking, has been operating in an ecosystem for years. Correspondent banking was encouraged by the regulators to treat payments in this ecosystem. They wanted them to develop a network, a closed network of compliant institutions. The network of correspondent and respondent banks are really tied together through FATF evaluation, Wolfsburg questionnaires, enhanced due diligence, audits, examinations of respondent banks, all to ensure that participants in this ecosystem, that each participant has the required elements to ensure compliance with the regulatory expectations of each bank in the network. So therefore, the highest expectation of the regulators in the network really seems to dominate that network. So if Europe sets a higher standard for privacy, that seems to dominate. If the US sets a higher standard for money laundering, that seems to dominate. If somebody comes out with an enhanced KYC version, that seems to predominate in that network because everybody wants to be able to move seamlessly inside that ecosystem. So that's how I think we should think about crypto and how sanctions and compliance are going to operate there, the same way we think about it in something like correspondent banking. So the next real question to ask is there any evidence that crypto is currently being used to evade sanctions? Well, the answer is not yet, and a little bit yes. So in reaction to the major Russian banks being sanctioned from SWIFT, Russians, as we've discussed, could turn to crypto to affect cross-border transactions through Russian crypto exchanges. This, as a theory, is yet to be proven out, but this week, as Senator Bragg in his opening remarks to the Blockchain Week alluded to, this potential evasion scenario may be there. He mentioned that the daily value of cryptocurrency transactions quadrupled from about 16 billion in US dollars to about 64 billion 2 days later after Russia was cut off from the SWIFT network. So it is possible that the increase in crypto, the value of crypto transaction is being fueled by the Russians getting cut off from the banking sector. But again, this is a theory that's yet to be proved out. Russians could also turn to newer privacy coins like Monero in an effort to evade transaction monitoring and surveillance efforts by well-regulated crypto exchanges. Again, we have to look for a longer period of time to see how those assets are reacting. But with Monero, it's always going to be difficult to determine who's using the product by design. We also have to look at, countries such as India and China have not really imposed unilateral sanctions on Russia. So Russia and Russians could use these jurisdictions and their crypto exchanges as proxies to undermine the effectiveness of economic sanctions that have been imposed so far. Again, we haven't seen evidence of that just yet, but that will play out over time. There is one crypto sanctions evasion typology that has been identified that's particularly relevant to Russia. Crypto analytics researchers first really identified crypto mining as a tactic to potentially evade US sanctions on Iran in 2021. Using the blockchain and the technology that allows crypto assets to be traced back to their source, there's just a huge advantage over traditional assets. Elliptic researchers were able to illustrate that Iran was able to evade sanctions effectively by selling millions of barrels of oil on global markets in the form of Bitcoin that was mined using otherwise sanctioned oil to power their mining operations in Iran. The tactic worked as the Iranian-based miners were paid directly with newly minted Bitcoin, which they then could use to pay for imports, bypassing payments through the Iranian financial institution. Knowing that Russia is a major energy producer, this is something for regulators in the crypto industry to keep in mind should sanctions remain in place over the long time. This typology does illustrate the very good natures of crypto that can allow us and well-regulated institutions to really look at these payments very closely or these transactions very closely in crypto, because we can source it all the way back to the original minting of the coin. Theoretically, you can follow those assets so closely that it becomes very difficult to launder those proceeds in some respects. But just like cash and other stores of value, there are ways, of course, to try to obscure that trail. So again, it's going to be looking at who you're dealing with and which counterparties you're dealing with in that ecosystem, just like correspondent banking, to say, if I'm dealing with reputable people that wouldn't take in bad assets, then I'm likely not to receive those bad assets. So it's compliance by committee in this ecosystem to close it off against the bad actors and really seal it into a community of people that are going to use crypto for licit or good purposes as opposed to illicit purposes. Well, next question really is around, is there any guidance from regulators on crypto sanctions compliance so far? Well, thankfully, the answer to that question is yes. Given that crypto does potentially operate as a means of sanctions evasion, global regulators have stepped up their scrutiny of crypto to ensure that economic sanctions remain effective. Specifically, they're trying to prevent assets that are acquired through crypto exchanges from really being converted to fiat in the regulated banking sector. So this is what's being called a fiat first approach, and it's the message that regulators are delivering to financial institutions in particular. They're delivering this message to financial institutions, even those institutions that don't believe that they have any crypto exposure, that don't take crypto, that don't custody crypto, that don't deal in crypto, and some that don't even tell their customers explicitly that they shouldn't be transacting with crypto exchanges. But they're saying anyway that these financial institutions must take precautions in relation to fiat transactions with the crypto sector. They must know who they're dealing with and the source of those funds coming into their institution. Specifically, the Department of Treasury has issued sanctions risk guidance for the crypto industry. In a recent update to their FAQ sanctions on Russian sanctions, the US Treasury Department made clear that Russia-related sanctions extend to virtual currencies. Referencing the sanctions imposed by OFAC, the FAQ stated that all persons, wherever they are located in the world, all US persons, are required to comply with OFAC regulations, regardless of whether those transactions are denominated in traditional fiat currency or in a virtual currency. So this is just reiterating the standard issue. US sanctions apply to every US person everywhere in the world, but they're specifically calling out that that applies to transactions in virtual currency. Similarly, the US banking regulator FinCEN has also issued guidance. On March 7th, FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, specifically addressed the use of crypto as a potential means of evasion and strongly encouraged all financial institutions to consider the use of innovative crypto analytics tools and solutions to assist in identifying hidden Russian and Belarusian assets. So really, FinCEN coming out strongly saying you have to look for these hidden assets and you have to use the tools available that apply to the new crypto environment. You can't use traditional fiat payment tools to look in an environment where crypto exists. You have to use all the tools available. FinCEN's guidance required that participants in the traditional fiat banking sector as a part of their existing AML and sanctions obligations, guard against becoming the fiat off-ramp or on-ramp for crypto transactions designed to evade global sanctions. Again, they're saying don't avoid all crypto. They're saying just avoid those crypto transactions that are designed to evade global sanctions, in particular US sanctions. It highlighted the risks to be considered in correspondent banking relationships, as correspondent banks don't always have a complete visibility into their customers' activities. In effect, FinCEN is also advocating this fiat-first approach to risk management, where it's incumbent on the regulated financial institution to detect and report transactions, including those sent or received by correspondent banking customers that can be characterized as potential sanctions evasion. Further, FinCEN specifically reminded regulated financial institutions that they need to specifically be cognizant of the risks of interactions that they have or their account holders have with crypto exchanges or virtual asset providers, VASPs, that may be used to evade Russian sanctions. Again, they're not saying avoid all contact with crypto exchanges. They're just warning you that if you're going to deal with an exchange, you should know who you're dealing with. You should know the quality of the transactions that you're doing, and you should know the quality of the compliance department on the other end of that transaction. Essentially, FinCEN is telling institutions that they have to perform risk-based diligence on the source of funds, particularly when they come from a VASP or a crypto exchange. Well, one question that might be asked is, and it's hard to describe without maybe a diagram or a slide, but I'll try. What would a fiat off-ramp look like in a bank? It's not going to look like much. And that's scary for those of us who've been the AML or sanctions compliance officer inside banks. If you just picture a large value wire coming in from a legal entity named MXB, SUX, XYZ, some generic name that you'd see on any old wire, all the bank is really going to see is a normal wire where the name XYZ is in the name and address field of the wire, the 103, the 202. That it's going to be in the name and address field, or it could be in some free text field like field 50, somewhere on the wire. If the bank is not looking for risky names or risky actors tied to crypto, and the transfer doesn't trigger some AML transaction monitoring rule, the bank may continue to receive funds from this seemingly innocuous source, deposited into a perfectly legitimate account that's in good standing at your bank for months or more. There's nothing that's going to stop that from coming in. It's not a sanctioned entity. It's just a very risky, potentially crypto exchange. So, how would you know that? So if you take XYZ and you start to do some basic research, or your FIU does, you might find out that it may be a Russian exchange. So essentially, the bank's not going to know either way, because the company, the sender of this money, is not your customer. It's just a counterparty sending funds to one of your clients. That research, though, may show that the generic sounding entity is actually operating out of the Czech Republic. The company was formed in the UK. It's got a single director who happens to be a Russian national. And if you look at their website, and you can find it, they're offering crypto exchange services in Russia. The website advertises that they take privacy coins like Monero, that they have no apparent KYC regulations or requirements for their users. But again, this is nothing you're going to see on the face of the wire unless you have some way of identifying the names of these Russian crypto exchanges. So that's why it's a little bit scary. Unless you have appropriate tools and access to data, you're not going to be able to find the source of that information. So I know I'm coming close to time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. There is guidance in Australia on this subject. Australia has implemented similar sanctions to the rest of the world. They've done a great job of really taking the 2014 sanctions, imposing more again now in 2022. They've placed the sanctions on additional 11 banks, I think on March 18th. But the Australian regulators haven't really come out with significant guidance on it. If you had to take a look and you were sitting in an Australian financial institution, you might want to take a look at what FinCEN and the Treasury are doing and what US financial institutions are doing in reaction to crypto compliance needs. It's going to be a way to get ahead of what AUSTRAC and the Australian regulators are eventually going to do. I think it's going to be a similar approach that everybody's had to AML and sanctions globally. So what can a financial institution do to mitigate their risk of running afoul of Russian sanctions? Well, the answer is really good blockchain analytics. Really only by leveraging a trusted provider of data and data analytics can you ensure that you're correctly identifying these designated individuals and entities. As discussed before, you need to identify any contact with Russian exchanges in your fiat transactions. You need to prevent becoming a fiat off-ramp and potentially coming in contact with risky sanctioned crypto activity. Your provider that you look for needs to consistently monitor news sources for new information, add it to its database, improve its coverage while remaining flexible in terms of allowing clients to adjust their own risk rules to fit the risk appetite of that particular institution. Where it's a risk-based approach is appropriate, you need to be able to control your own risk ratings. Where sanctions is appropriate and it's a sanctioned entity, of course, there's no room for error. It's going to be strict liability. You're going to want to identify that correctly. But if it's a risk-based scenario of whether you want to deal with an exchange, you're going to need more analytics and you're going to need more information to make those judgments appropriately. At Elliptic, we've been doing this since 2018 when the first sanctioned entity was added to the US sanctions list as a sanctioned crypto entity, a crypto wallet. And before that, going back to 2013, we've been monitoring the web for bad actors of all kinds, including Russians, for ransomware, credit card fraud, you name it. And we've been labeling those wallets. So we have a rich history of protecting our clients and maintaining a robust database where we can identify bad actors. So it's important to work with a trusted provider to keep your institution safe. In conclusion, it's really hard to believe it's only been 1 month since the invasion of Ukraine. We've seen the entire global community come together and implement significant, hopefully compelling sanctions designed to basically crush the Russian aggression. Hopefully these sanctions can be lifted eventually so the Russian people can rejoin the global community after the aggressive regime has been removed. And hopefully through this discussion, you can see that cryptocurrencies, even as new players in the financial sector, have an important part to play in enforcing these critical regulations. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions and need any resources that I've discussed, you can visit elliptic.co, where we have a staff of compliance professionals, former regulators, who are keeping you and our customers up to date on all these developments, and we're always happy to answer any questions. So I think that's time for me, and back to the hosts of Blockchain Week. Thank you.